Hello? Good evening. Okay. I can hear me now too. Good almost afternoon. Thank you all for sticking with us before lunch. So as Ray said, actually I also go by Ray, so if you get a call from an OPDP reviewer saying they're Ray Conklin, that's me. So as Ray said, I am a reviewer with the Office of Prescription Drug Promotion, or OPDP. And so OPDP is responsible for reviewing promotional material for prescription drug products. And that means that we review a broad array of materials that come in. And the review process is different for different types of materials. There are different requirements for different types of submissions that come in. All of that information is provided in detail through our guidance documents, frequently asked questions, references and everything on OPDP's page on the FDA website, which has been newly redone. It looks great. So please visit that page if you have questions about our mission, our organization, all of that good stuff. But today, we're really going to be focusing on launch submissions to OPDP. And so our learning objectives are to improve understanding of the submission of launch promotional materials to OPDP and to address challenges or questions that may occur during the launch phase. So really the launch phase is an important part of the drug promotion process. These are initial materials. They may be time sensitive. Companies are looking to get these materials out the door. They want to be able to promote on their products. And there are certain challenges or issues that may come up over and over again that we see a lot. And so I just kind of want to address a lot of those things today. So before I dive, though, into the launch issues themselves, I just want to give a very short introduction to drug promotion in general to kind of provide a foundation for the information that I'll be presenting regarding launches. So OPDP receives its regulatory authority through the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And with certain limited exceptions, such as drugs approved under accelerated approval, the requirement for the submission of promotional materials is that they be submitted along with a completed Form FDA 2253 at the time of first use. So when the materials are being initially disseminated into the world, you're also going to send them along with the 2253 to OPDP, letting us know that you're using these materials. Now, sponsors may also submit before the materials go out on 2253. They may also submit voluntarily promotional materials for advisory comment from OPDP. And what this means is that a sponsor is asking for OPDP's input on materials prior to using them in the public domain. We would then review the materials, provide advisory comments to the sponsor. The sponsor may use those comments to revise those materials if they choose. Again, this is voluntary unless there are certain exceptions, such as accelerated approval drugs, and I will cover accelerated approval launches a little bit later on because they are kind of specific and have specific requirements. So promotional material falls into two categories: promotional labeling and advertising. And I'm not going to go into the specifics of like what defines promotional labeling or what defines advertising. That information is available in the regulations that are available on FDA's website. It's really detailed and complicated and would be a presentation, I think, in and of itself. But sort of just take away that we review all types of promotional materials. So everything from television ads, radio advertisements, speaker presentations for representatives of the company, brochures, journal ads, everything is going to come into FDA in one form or another, and we would be able to see it, look at it. And you can submit any of those things for advisory comments. There are specific requirements for inclusion in different types of promotional materials when you're submitting to OPDP. And for that, I would refer you to the draft guidance providing regulatory submissions in electronic and non-electronic format, promotional labeling and advertising for human prescription drugs. Again, I'm not going to go way down that rabbit hole today. So, launches. Launches are the initial promotional materials for a product. They may be voluntarily submitted for advisory comments, unless they're accelerated approval or some other super specific exception. And these are really one of OPDP's top priorities because consumers and healthcare providers are forming their first impressions or a drug or use of a drug, and those impressions can really be lasting once they're formed. So it's really important that they are based on accurate and balanced information. And so we really take launches seriously, and we know that these are a huge priority for sponsors as well. So the launch phase typically constitutes 120 calendar days from the approval of a new drug, an indication. Any of the things on the slide can trigger a launch. And launch materials can be submitted either before approval or after approval, anytime during that 120 calendar day period. There are a couple of exceptions to that 120 days from approval launch phase. The first is in cases where a drug is not marketed initially upon approval. So there could be a situation where there's a delay in manufacturing of a product and the sponsor is not initially marketing the drug because it's not available. So once that product is available and the sponsor decides to start marketing the drug, the launch phase would begin at the initial marketing of the product. The other situation where there is an exception to that 120-day after approval launch phase is for audience-specific marketing. So this is a situation where, for example, sponsor initially markets only to a healthcare provider audience, and then later on, even 2 years down the line, can be really any time frame, they decide to develop promotional materials to market to a consumer audience. And at that time, they can submit voluntarily to OPDP for advisory comments on those consumer materials. Now keep in mind that this is only the case when there has been no marketing to one of those audiences. So if they initially develop a really broad marketing strategy for their healthcare provider audience and then just have a consumer website and later decide to sort of flesh out their consumer marketing with a patient brochure or something like that, you can always submit that patient brochure for advisory comments, but if there was already materials for that audience out there, it would not be considered a launch. So, tips for a smooth submission process. So these really apply to any promotional materials submitted to OPDP, but I think are especially important in terms of launches just because sponsors want to get the launch out the door. We want to be able to review the launches in a timely fashion. These are all issues that can kind of hold up or delay OPDP's ability to review a launch submission. So the first one is to revise to reflect the current label or the final label. So this is especially applicable, I think, for accelerated approval products where materials are submitted prior to approval, so potentially prior to approved labeling or finalized labeling. But it can also occur with full approval products when a sponsor, for whatever reason, decides to submit prior to approval. So any materials that are based on draft labeling would need to be updated to reflect the final labeling, really for OPDP to begin our review. Now, there are certain limited circumstances where we will provide comments based on draft labeling. Usually that's press releases. So we would provide comments based on draft labeling with the understanding that the sponsor would then revise the final materials to reflect the final labeling. But just sometimes there's a little bit of a misunderstanding or miscommunication that there is an expectation that materials that are submitted based on draft labeling be revised to reflect final labeling. So just to clarify that. So legibility. This is maybe my favorite topic because it seems like common sense, like we need to be able to read the materials in order to review the materials. But I think it's one of the most common things that happens that we receive promotional materials in OPDP that cannot be read. So maybe parts of them are clear, but the footnotes are in a tiny text, or it's a website that has been rotated and put into a PDF file or printed out onto a paper submission, and you can't read this tiny font. We need to be able to read every part of a submission, every part of those promotional materials needs to be legible, from the footnotes up through those big headline claims. So please, please make sure when you are submitting that those materials can be read, and this includes both clean and annotated materials. So all promotional materials that are submitted for advisory comment have to be submitted in a clean and an annotated form. And those annotated materials are often suffer from like a PDF conversion. So however those annotations are inserted in the file, it may affect the ability to actually enlarge and be able to review the full text on the page. So just be conscious that legibility applies to both the clean and annotated pieces. And then that brings us down to annotations. So as I said, we require both a clean and annotated copy of promotional materials that are submitted for advisory comments. And those annotations really need to be clear. They need to be comprehensive. That means all of the claims that are included in those materials, from your headlines to your footnotes, anything that you may think is self-evident because it's from the prescribing information, all of those things still need to be annotated. And the annotations need to be clear as to where the OPDP reviewer can find that information in the references that are provided. So an annotation that simply says, see Lancaster 2016 would not necessarily be able to facilitate our review, because then we'd be reading, an entire article by Lancaster in order to try to figure out what part of that you're citing. So, just try to be as clear as possible, and if you have questions about how to best achieve that, absolutely contact your OPDP reviewer and talk to them, especially if this is your first time submitting materials to OPDP, or maybe you haven't submitted materials in a while. Just reach out to us, and we are here for you. I would much prefer to have a sponsor call me every day and ask me questions than to have to call you and say, hey, can you please revise this and send it back to us again? Because that just delays your work product getting back to you. So a note on press releases. I mentioned previously that there are times where OPDP may review materials based on draft labeling, and that can be a press release. And we recognize that press releases are extremely time sensitive. We know that there needs to be a business decision to move forward with a press release, to issue a press release when you have an approval. It's really important. And we try to review press releases in the most time-sensitive fashion possible. We really try to turn these around for everyone. However, there have been situations where we have received press releases that are very complex. They include a lot of claims or presentations that are outside of the package insert, so a lot of extra data, anything like that, that requires a higher level of review or requires us to reach out to our review division and consultation, which can obviously delay the review process. In the past, we have always tried to review those materials anyway and try to get them back to you in a 72-hour time frame, 24 to 72 hours. But we've found that ultimately with those more complicated materials, we are providing comments that are not, inclusory of everything. Maybe we don't have a consult back, or the sponsor really just needs to move forward with the materials just from a business perspective before we're able to provide our comments. However, the reviewers have already spent a significant amount of time working on these materials. So what we are saying now is that generally there is a 2 working day turnaround for the review of draft PRs when requested by the sponsors. However, in order to be considered for that 2 working day turnaround, those press releases need to be derivative of the product information. So the FDA approved labeling only. They can't include references outside of the FDA approved labeling. And this includes quotations from expert sources. So we still review quotes that are included in press releases as claims that are made about the product. So just keep this in mind if you want to submit a press release for advisory comments, to either talk to your OPDP reviewer about, what is a reasonable timeline for submitting more in advance of approval if it's going to be more complex, or just make sure it's just derivative of the PI so we can do that sort of more expedited turnaround. Okay, accelerated approval launches. So accelerated approval products have very specific requirements for submission of promotional materials to OPDP, and the launches are a little different and I think can be a little bit confusing. Even though full approval products represent there are far more of them, so we have more full approval launches, I would say that the majority of questions that I get are based on accelerated approval launches or accelerated approval products. There's just, it's just different. If you haven't, dealt with an accelerated approval product before and are now trying to submit to OPDP, or you haven't dealt with it in a while, or maybe there's kind of a weird issue that arises during the review process, just reach out to your OPDP reviewer. That's what we're here for. So with the accelerated approval launches, the launch phase is still 120 days from approval, or any of those exceptions that I talked about. But all materials that are intended for use in that first 120 days have to be submitted to OPDP prior to approval, right? So before the drug is approved, everything that's supposed to be used in that launch phase has to be submitted to us. And I know that that is a lot. And I know that that can be really challenging from a business perspective as you're trying to get this drug approved. You're working on the labeling, and you are also having to develop your promotional materials for the product to submit before that approval date. So basically, as soon as you know you're getting accelerated approval or suspect that you're getting accelerated approval, because maybe it's not abundantly clear during the review phase until a little bit later on, contact your OPDP reviewer. They may also be in contact with you just to make sure that you're on the same page, and they can really work with you to figure out what is the best way to satisfy that pre-submission requirement. So this is just the timeline of submission for accelerated approval materials. You can see the pre-submission period. And then the one thing I do want to note is that all advisory or all promotional materials for accelerated approval have to be pre-submitted to OPDP at least 30 days prior to their first intended use. This is for non-launch materials. So if you're intending to start using some newly developed promotional materials that weren't included in your launch phase, like right after the launch phase ends, say day 121, you would need to start submitting those materials still during the launch phase to satisfy that 30-day pre-submission requirement. So just keep that in mind as well. Okay, so this is really moving towards the end of the presentation. Just kind of a few notes wrapping up about the submission process. So we recognize that the submission process is not always completely clear-cut. We have, the guidances, the regulations, all of that material is available on the OPDP website. Your reviewer is available for questions, but there may be, situations that are a little bit nuanced or confusing, like what do you do when there are, two sponsors that own two separate drugs that are being marketed together because they're approved for use together. So situations like that, that's where, your OPDP reviewers are going to be your best resource, because those things may not be covered in all of the guidances. All of that detailed information in our website may not cover, those sort of niche situations. So we're really here for you. Please call us. We had a fantastic presentation yesterday about ECTD submissions, so I'm not going to go in depth about that. I just want to say that if you have questions relating to ECTD submissions to OPDP, please, please, please reach out to our ECTD team. Their email address is there, and there's an OPDP-specific ECTD team. So they will be best able to answer questions about ECTD submissions. I would say that most OPDP reviewers, myself included, are not experts in that electronic gateway or the ECTD submission process, coding, all of that stuff. We are absolutely here to try to answer your questions, but more than likely, if you have a specific question about that, we're going to be referring you to our ECTD team. And so really following up on that, though, I do have a personal plug for ECTD. So it's not yet required for submissions to OPDP to come in electronically. We still take paper submissions. But electronic submissions are, in my opinion, just absolutely amazing. When I first started at OPDP, all of these submissions were paper, and now I would say, you know, a very good portion of the sponsors I work with regularly submit electronically, and it's fantastic. The submissions come in immediately, so there's not really a delay in us getting the submissions from the document room or having them scanned in, having them mailed to us. So it sort of cuts out on that delay in us being able to look at the materials. It's also just better organized, so it's much easier to see if something is missing, or if there is, you know, potentially a deficiency, such as, like, you know, it hasn't been scanned in properly, or, sorry, it's not scanned in ECTD, but the font is too small, file is corrupted. There's something that's preventing us from reviewing it. It's much easier to identify that quickly when it's electronic. And then also, it just cuts down on paperwork, so there's less you having to make binders, us having to break down binders, and then all of that paper eventually being shredded. So I still distinctly remember I was here for maybe 2 years, and I got a paper submission, and the actual promotional materials were about 3 pages, and it came with 400 pages of references. Yeah, I'm not exaggerating. So it was, I was really scared when I got it, because I was like, oh my God, what are they sending in? Like, I'm gonna have to review all this. And it was just references. And then all of that went into the shredder. So, and that was for an accelerated approval product. So they had to submit that. So it wasn't, you know, just a voluntary submission. Okay, so with the submission process, the last thing I want to talk about are 2 particular types of supporting documents. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think that this is an area where there are frequent, maybe miscommunications from OPDP to the sponsor, or maybe a misunderstanding from the sponsor in terms of what we mean when we're talking about revising materials. So there may be times where the OPDP reviewer will ask a sponsor to revise and resubmit materials to OPDP, maybe because the font's not legible, maybe they're missing a reference or something like that. And there are actually 2 specific categories of supporting documents that are used for this. And it's really relevant for ECTD submissions because we're not really able to change the supporting document type in ECTD. So with paper submissions, the document room can actually, like, edit the supporting document type if it's not correct on the paper submission, whereas in ECTD, they cannot do that. So if the submission type is incorrect, they would actually have to reject the submission, which can result in delays. So the first type of supporting document is a resubmission supporting document. So despite OPDP reviewers asking for, you know, sponsors to maybe revise and resubmit promotional materials, that's not actually a resubmission document. Resubmissions are used to respond to an advisory letter that has been received. So whether that is sending back the materials for another round of advisory review, or maybe you're rebutting one of our letters, I hope not, but it is responding to an advisory letter that you have received. Amendments are used to submit materials that were missing from the original submission. And then there are 2 types of supporting documents that fall under the amendment tree. Amendments, which I know is confusing because it's amendments falling under amendments, but it's amendments and reference documents. So amendments, the big difference between the 2 is that amendments should include at least 1 clean material, and the reference document does not include clean material. So for example, for an amendment, say the OPDP reviewer goes to open that electronic submission and the file for the clean copy is corrupted, or they, you know, get the paper submission and the font is too small to read on the clean copy, the OPDP reviewer would then call the sponsor and ask them to submit an amendment where they would then send back the revised copy of the clean materials. Now, the amendment can also include other materials aside from that clean copy. So maybe that submission was also missing one of the cited references. That document just wasn't included. That can also be included with the amendment submission as long as it's a clean material that's also being sent back. The reference document, because it does not include clean materials, an example would be, for instance, if the reviewer were to open up a submission and find that the annotated PI was missing, there's only a clean version, they would then contact the sponsor and say, hey, we're missing the annotated PI, can you submit this as a reference document? And then that reference document would be sent in. It can just be that annotated PI with a cover sheet just saying, this was missing from the initial submission, here's the annotated version. And that is it. I see.
Thank you, Rachel. Whoop, I'm a little hot, but can you bring it down? We are going to go ahead and do our last bit of Q&A before the lunch break. You know how our game is played. If you have questions in the room, come on down. Online, I saw a lot of questions pouring on. Since we do have somebody here at the microphone, we'll start here in the room.
I think I might have organized my question a little bit better, put it together. So if I have say for instance, a doctor that believes that a dietary supplement helps to reduce the negative side effects of an approved drug, and he wants me to repackage that in a convenience kit, okay? Is that, for one, a claim for the dietary supplement? And two, could I then market that as different labeling in that kit saying that it would reduce negative side effects of said approved drug? Does that make sense?
Right. So first, we don't review promotional materials for dietary supplements. Right. Dietary supplements are handled by CFSAN, the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. If you are making a claim about a dietary supplement, that gets into a little bit more specific or maybe muddy waters in terms of the implications of that claim, and are you marketing that dietary supplement in an appropriate fashion. And so I really would suggest, talking to the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition regarding your intention for, marketing a dietary supplement in that way. We don't review dietary supplements. And as far as I'm understanding it, you're not intending to package this with the drug. You're just making a claim about the drug. And I don't want to make comments about that specific situation because I think that there are some implications there. So I would start by contacting the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. I'm not sure exactly who handles their dietary supplement, department, but that's where you would probably want to start.
Thank you.
Okay. And again, if there's any other questions in the room, please come on up to the microphones. But let's start with our first online question.
It was our understanding that a submission would need to be done only if it contains claims about the drug product. However, if it does not, no OPDP submission is required. Can you clarify the requirements for press releases?
Oh, for a press release. So if you're saying if it contains claims about a product, so if you're just announcing that the product is approved, I'm not really understanding how this applies to, drug promotion. If you're not talking about a product, then no, you wouldn't need to submit it to OPDP. But I mean, when we're talking about claims for a product, we're even talking about intended use of a product. So even if the press release just says that this drug was approved for this indication, you're still talking about the indication and intended use of a drug, and it's you would still need to submit that to OPDP. You don't have to submit it for advisory comments unless your drug is accelerated approval. It would come in on a form FDA 2253. It's my best understanding.
Next question, please, Ray.
How do we contact OPDP with questions if we do not know who the OPDP reviewer is at the time of launch?
Absolutely. So I think this comes up a lot as you just don't know how to get a hold of us. So if you don't know who your OPDP reviewer is, I suggest asking the RPM, the review project manager that you're working with in the review division, for your, the review of the drug. They will be able to, if they don't know who the OPDP reviewer is, contact our project manager and find out. But it's more than likely that they know who the OPDP reviewer is because we are involved in reviewing labeling as well during review of drug products.
And again, if there's any questions in the room, come on up to the mics. But Ray, let's take another online question, please.
How soon does OPDP expect promotional materials to be updated following a label update? Does it depend on the type of label update, and how would we be able to get this information?
So there is not a specific time requirement for the updating of promotional materials. I will say that safety labeling updates are really expected to be done very quickly because that is impactful to the public health in terms of, making sure that healthcare providers and consumers are aware of, additional risks of the drug. Certainly if a warning and precaution or contraindication is added, that's something that, really needs to be communicated or updated quickly in the labeling. There is not a specific time frame for that. There are additional specific requirements for safety labeling updates related to accelerated approval products, but unless somebody wants me to specifically go into that, I won't. But just be aware of that, and if you have questions, call your OPDP reviewer.
Okay, and we have a question here in the room, nice and close to the mic, please.
Hi, my name is Matt Aureo. I'm with 88 Pharma. I've got a question about products in development.
Okay.
Is there sort of a bright line if you've got a product in development and you're developing it for a target? How do you sort of talk about that and not run afoul of?
Okay, so that is something that comes up, and if you look at our enforcement actions, we have touched on products that are not approved, sort of appearing as though they were approved products. So we don't review materials for unapproved products. However, we are very cognizant of them, and I think the best thing that I can say about it is to ensure that you're very clear in stating that this product is not approved, that it is in development, and that is very clearly communicated, and that you're not making any claims about the safety of the drug being known, anything like that, or any claims about the efficacy of the drug being known. So you can't say that it's known to be effective in this population or whatever. So just very clear when you're communicating the data that maybe it's based on preclinical studies, that this drug is still in clinical trials, it has not been approved for any indication, etc.
Okay.
I hope that was okay.
Next online question, please, Ray.
Is there a plan to make all submissions in ECTD in the future if these submissions are easier to handle?
So the ECTD submission requirement has been implemented for other areas of submissions. I think as was discussed yesterday, there are certain types of submissions that must be submitted in ECTD. It will be required for submissions to OPDP in the future. That will happen, I believe, once the guidance that I mentioned is finalized. It's currently in draft form. And so once that guidance is finalized, I believe it's 24 months after the guidance is finalized that submissions would be required in electronic format. I believe that's the case, but I don't know when that guidance will be finalized. So for the foreseeable future, paper submissions are still permitted. I just personally encourage electronic submissions. It's not required.
Another online question, please.
Which materials, if any, must be submitted to OPDP for advisory comments?
So unless you have a product that is approved under accelerated approval, or there are a couple of other limited exceptions. So there are drugs that are approved when human efficacy studies are not ethical or feasible, and drugs approved under the limited population pathway for antibacterial and antifungal drugs. I've never run into those particular instances, so it's mostly from our perspective accelerated approval products. There is no requirement, unless you're accelerated approval or those other things that I mentioned, to submit materials for advisory comment. It's entirely voluntary. So you're just looking for OPDP's input on the materials, to sort of ensure that we're on the same page, that the materials are fair and balanced.
Okay, and we've got time for one more online question, please.
For OPDP submissions that are a video file, is there a file size limit for an ECTD submission, or is that an OPDP ECTD group question?
That is a question for the OPDP ECTD group. I do not know.
Okay, and that one was so quick that if you've got another one back there, Ray, we can do one more.
When you voluntarily submit for an advisory comment, can this be done by ECTD, and by when is feedback provided to the sponsor?
So yes, you absolutely can submit advisories through ECTD. Please do. And in terms of our timeline for feedback, that would be something to really discuss with your reviewer. In terms of, we do prioritize materials for review. So like we would be looking at launch materials sort of first, because they represent those initial materials. So those are subject to like specific review timelines and everything. Non-launch advisories we would then sort of look at in a way of like, is this for a safety update? That may be something that we would really prioritize review again, because it really impacts the public health. So in terms of expectation of review timeline for non-launch advisories, I would really reach out and communicate with your OPDP reviewer, because they'll individually be able to give you a better sense of like what our expected timeline is based on workloads.
All right, and that is all the time we have for questions. Please help me thank Rachel for coming